So my talk is long titled, You Can't Always Get What You Want, but You Get What You Need. Because when we deal with the very thorny issues of content moderation in end-to-end encrypted environment, those problems are really difficult to solve. So they're not always going to be perfect solutions. The paper came out in August, last August, 2021. It was published by the Center for Democracy and Technology, and the title of the paper is not the title of this talk. It's titled Outside Looking In, Approaches to Content Moderation in End-to-End Encrypted Systems. And I have to thank also the folks who helped with it. So there were others at CDT. It was a group effort. Emma Alonso, who's our Freedom of Expression Director, Greg Nojime, who leads our security and surveillance team. Also from Brown, we had Cindy Kamara, who's also speaking this week, and Lucy Kin, who helped with that publication. And I have to also thank my co-author and co-illustrator for the slides that she made for me for this talk. So the first part of the paper, and what's really important when we embark on this subject, is understanding content moderation, and then understanding end-to-end encryption, and then we put them together and we look at a variety of different proposals for how to do content moderation in end-to-end encryption. But when I start talking about content moderation, first I want to be clear on the scope of what content moderation can do and can't do, or what it aims to do. So folks that are familiar with content moderation will know all of this already. So the first thing is that platforms engaging in content moderation are trying to remove substantial amounts of content at scale that are in violation of, one, local laws, which is alleged because there's no court determination or ruling on that, or two, the terms of service of the platform. Another scope restriction is that in end-to-end encrypted systems, we are necessarily limited to top-down platform approaches. Because you have to sort of undertake them through a central service, meaning that other things that aren't top down would be, for example, you have page managers or subreddit moderators. Those things are not top down, and they're content moderation mechanisms, but you can't use that in end-to-end encryption. And then lastly, another scope restriction is that it's not really possible, it isn't possible, to technically define objective definition or distinction between what is acceptable content and what is not. So there's nothing between two images, this gets back to folks talking about disinformation, nothing tells you technically the difference between two pieces of content that is something that is not inherent to the content itself, if that makes sense. So then in content moderation, there are 6 phases. I'm only going to go into depth on one of them that's relevant for this. But you have, in the first phase, definition, where obviously the platform needs to define what's acceptable and what's not. It needs to make that understood for a variety of different audiences, internally, to the users, any sort of adjudicating body, third-party auditor, whatever. In the detection phase, obviously that is where you actually have to then take the definition of the content you're looking for, that you're trying to remove or action in some way, and find it, or have it reported to you and so on. I'm actually going to go into much more depth on the detection phase, because that's actually the phase that matters the most in this. After that, then there's evaluation. So has the content been detected correctly been detected? You have to take a step back before you move on to the next phase, which is what a lot of us think of when we think of content moderation, and that's the enforcement phase. And there are so very many steps in enforcement, or so many possible actions, I guess, is a better way of putting it. It's not just removal, it's all kinds of possible things. You can look at behavior, you can look at content, you can throttle behavior, you can, so the list is really long. We're not going to have time to go into it, and it's also not necessarily important, at least for the purposes of the paper that we wrote, although I'll get to how we might look at this as for sort of future work. Then there needs to be appeal. So if you've made a decision about a piece of content, users need to be able to appeal that. And they probably want to, because especially when you're using layers potentially of automation, mistakes can be made. And then that typically then punts things back to the evaluation phase and so on. And then lastly, and this has not been super linear, it's not really linear in practice, right? But the last phase we're mentioning is education. So back when you're defining what is allowed and what isn't, it's important that users actually understand what that means. And the education process happens throughout so that there's clarity around what's happening. So with that in mind, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the detection phase, and I'm going to leave the rest for another discussion. In the detection phase of content moderation, there are so many axes. It isn't just three sort of axes that we need to deal with. It's multiple ones, but that's hard to draw. So the three I think that matter the most is when platforms are coming up with a strategy for detection. They can think about detecting it before, right? There's been an incident, or they can deal with the after effects, right? So before you post or after you post. There are ways to interrupt and detect content before, for example, it gets turned into viral content at scale. Another axis that platforms might consider when doing content moderation is along the reactive proactive axis. Do you wait for people to tell you that content is a problem, or it's reported, or do you actually go out and look for it? Do you go out and look for things that you don't want on your platform, or things that violate terms of service or laws? And then the other thing that detection needs to worry about is detecting content versus detecting metadata. And this isn't totally true, but I think from the mental model I have in my head is that content obviously is the substance or the thing that's being uploaded, and metadata often is around behavior. So if you are worried about coordinated trolling behavior or things like that, you're probably monitoring and looking at metadata. If you're securing your system against some kind of attack, like a lot of times that's used with metadata and that sort of thing. So again, there are many other dimensions to this, but I wanted to highlight those three. So now I'm going to shift to talking about encryption. Don't want to get too deep in it, because a lot of you are subject matter experts, but it's important, I think, to have a solid definition of what we're talking about with respect to encryption before we put the two together and then look at proposals for it. So how exactly encryption is implemented in the system really depends on who gets access to the data and how. That's sort of, the point. And the point is that as few people as possible do, except those that are authorized. So because encryption can only guarantee confidentiality between parties that share an encryption key, one of the most important considerations when deploying encryption is how to manage key sharing, clearly. In this shared exchange, coupled with confidentiality of encryption, this allows systems designers to protect data in transit. You can protect it while it's at rest, and you can protect data between endpoints. What is encryption, or what is end-to-end encryption even, is surprisingly not agreed upon if you look at the ways in which it can be implemented differently. So there's some agreement or some convergence around use of, for end-to-end encrypted messaging, for example, use of the signal protocol. There's an effort in the IETF to standardize something called the messaging layer security protocol, which could be used in messaging, it could be used in video, it could be used in a variety of different contexts. But what the features are, does end-to-end encryption have to include perfect forward secrecy or deniability or other kinds of features? That is not necessarily agreed upon. And so it's worth defining, and there's an effort in the IETF to do that. So just to spark your imagination of what we're talking about concretely here then in content moderation and end-to-end encrypted systems, we're talking about systems, services, or apps that are end-to-end encrypted if the keys used to decrypt and encrypt data are known only to the sender and the authorized recipients of the content. So examples: storage, iCloud, messaging, Signal, email, PGP. There are actually proposals for then how to do content moderation in end-to-end encrypted systems. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is, I think, a thorough, at least in August it was, a really thorough go at looking at all the different proposals that we'd seen. There was a report leaked out of the European Council that had 12 proposals. Some of them included just straight up backdoors and other things like that. So we'd seen quite a few, and we wanted to take them in turn and evaluate whether or not these approaches violated end-to-end encryption. That was the primary goal. So these proposals, there are 5. I'm not probably going to have time to go into every single one of them, but the first one is user reporting. So what happens? I mean, can you use blocking and user reporting, user empowerment features in messaging apps to do content moderation, and what does that look like? What about metadata analysis? I mean, you probably want to reduce the amount of metadata you have in a secure private app, but there is some. Can you use some of it? Is that possible? Another one is traceability. This is a proposal that became really popular in India and in Brazil, actually in the legal framework, to figure out how to trace messages that were being sent primarily through WhatsApp. So a lot of it was a concern over disinformation, for example. The scheme doesn't have anything to do with looking at the content in the way that it's proposed, but it just asks the platform, can you tell me where this came from? Who was the first person to send this message? How many people have seen it? That sort of thing. And it seems like it doesn't break encryption because it's not talking about the content, but we'll get into that. Perceptual hashing, this is where you sort of are comparing known content that you already have a database of that isn't allowed, it's not allowed. Can you just make sure that it never winds up on your platform ever again? That's perceptual hashing, meaning that it doesn't even have to be an exact match. It could be kind of a match, and it would get flagged. And then taking it a step further, predictive matching would be, could you take known stuff and come up with a way to find novel stuff that matches the bad stuff, right? So yeah, the user reporting. This is actually one of the ones we didn't think was terrible, and it provides a lot of user agency. So, proposed cryptographic schemes to enable the reporting by users to service providers of end-to-end encrypted messages seems like a fine thing. You would want to make sure there'd be some privacy involved. So if you've got 2 endpoints, say, and one of the endpoints receives a piece of content that they want to report, they can do that a variety of ways. You could very much just take a screenshot or walk your phone to law enforcement. But you could also then maybe use the platform to do that as well. You might want to ensure some degree of privacy if your platform is doing that. So you might be able to achieve that with message franking, which ensures that messages can only be decrypted and verified by the service provider and nobody else beyond the original sender and recipients. So it does preserve confidentiality and privacy. I don't think that there's necessarily a problem with the expectations there. And the problem, one issue though, that it does lose deniability. So if your platform was hoping to offer, users something a little bit more in terms of features of end-to-end encryption, deniability wouldn't be possible because A sends a message to B, B can authenticate that message from A but cannot prove this to anyone else. That's not going to be possible because you're trying to prove this content came from somewhere. We would just suggest then that for platforms that are looking to do this, message franking and user reporting, that they would just be very clear to users about the loss of deniability. So metadata analysis. Metadata is data about data. Things like file size, type of file, date and time of the send, who sent it, who received it, and more could potentially be detected. And it's not always clear from the outside what kinds of metadata is being collected. We would not necessarily suggest creating more metadata to do analysis. But in general, what metadata is there might be a way of doing some degree of content moderation, especially in terms of behavior. So again, when we think about content moderation, it isn't actually just content, it's content and behavior moderation. If you're abusing the system, if you're spamming people, et cetera, there should be some recourse to that. And you can use metadata to detect that and to do something about it. Other things like account information, IP address, the last time you logged in, the volume of your activity, the frequency of your posting, other signals like that. Again, like, wouldn't necessarily think that platforms should be tracking new things, but just to use what's already there seems like a good idea, as long as no new metadata is created for things beyond message delivery. It is something, though, I think that's a bit controversial, because we know that a lot can be gleaned from metadata, and so platforms should always be reducing the amount of metadata that they keep, for sure. So I will spend just really, really quickly, so I can get to the end of my slides, but so traceability, I think of traceability as enhanced metadata. It's exactly what we don't want platforms to do. If platforms are probably not tracking every single origin of a message and who it passes through and who sees it and how many, that's an extra ask. That is taking an end-to-end encrypted messaging system and building additional features on top of it to aid law enforcement. The other thing that we realized, and when talking to people about how the law was being proposed in India and Brazil, was that there was an assumption, actually, that that law enforcement or some agency had the content. Like, somebody had forwarded them the message, or they've seen it. The point is they've already got it. They're trying to detect it. So yes, it's not backdooring. But it is, I think, it does violate privacy, since users haven't willingly shared this data. It's a creation of new data about the data, and I think it implicitly violates confidentiality. So we would reject traceability, and the paper goes into a lot more depth. Perceptual hash matching, this is, you'll hear a lot about scanning, server scanning, client-side scanning, going back to that axes where you could do it, before it gets posted or after it gets posted, not something that we would recommend. The question, there are a lot of questions in the paper about whether or not it's even effective, whether or not it's good enough, and just in general, we're very sensitive, as you'll have read. After this paper came out, there was one called Bugs in Your Pockets that really goes at the notion of client-side scanning. Predictive modeling is essentially worse than perceptual hashing, and so we also rejected it for looking for novel content in an encrypted system, into encrypted systems. We're definitely interested in doing future research. A couple of things that we're interested in. What are the bounds for meaningful privacy and confidentiality in large group chats? That's something that seems to be a particularly different problem than if you just have two people trying to have a private conversation. We also are worried about post-detection actions. So the steps that follow detection in terms of enforcement really matter quite a lot. And so our research doesn't go into that, but that's somewhere where we would like to look at more of, because depending on what you do, I think actually can matter whether or not you're doing the metadata or the user reporting, right? And then it's also interesting to think about what are some of the hard problems around repeat offenders and cross-platform moderation practices, and how might this fit into that. So I have just this last slide, but I feel like I have very little time to tell you about it. I think that there's potentially something coming out this year. At some point, we'll get around to writing some of these things down. But it goes back to how platforms, and I'm thinking particularly of messaging apps, implement some of these ideas. So one thing that I think, I'll give you just one example, and then hopefully I can post these somewhere, maybe on Twitter. Let's say, autocorrect on your keyboard when you're typing in messages. Kind of a great feature. You could do similar things that Apple was proposing, for example, around giving speed bumps if you're using certain language, or if you have certain speech patterns, like that might be kind of interesting to look at as an in-app feature. But what we're worried about is that if that is a sort of machine learning enabled feature, that it is breaking the promise of end-to-end encryption because it's sort of leaking outside the app and it's sort of, quote, calling home. That would be something that would not really work, right? It would not preserve confidentiality, and it's a vector, I think, for weakening encryption. So things like that are principles we want to write down so that, if you are running an end-to-end encrypted platform and you want to improve user experience and user agency by introducing some of these features, that you can do that without accidentally weakening your system or giving users some feature that they don't want that makes their conversations less confidential and that sort of thing. It would be worth, I think, thinking about that and writing them down. So that was my last slide, and that's sort of what I proposed. And I apologize about, I feel like it's a bit unreadable, but anyway, so the thing I think that is important to remember about this topic is that platforms are moderating end-to-end encryption without breaking it. Now is a really critical time to define what are the required features of end-to-end encryption, what breaks that and what doesn't. Thanks.